Well, my name is Marshall Phelps. I frankly am thrilled to be here to do this. I think it's a worthwhile undertaking, and I'll give you a little bit of my background first, and then maybe at the end discuss some of the things I've worked on. But I was born here in Atlanta, in Piedmont Hospital. Haven't been back to Atlanta all that much, but I lived here when the beginning of my life, and then ultimately ended up in upstate New York in a little town called Binghamton. It used to be a much bigger town than it is now because IBM and Endicott Johnson and Ansco and GE and all of that kind of packed up and moved out, just like it happened in Rochester with Xerox and Kodak. Same difference. And but I grew up there. Went to Binghamton Central High School, where I was just a god-awful student. And if it hadn't been for the standardized tests you took every year in New York State, and if you passed, they had to pass you, I'd still be in high school. But I did pretty well in the standardized tests, much better than my parents certainly expected me to. And I ended up in a small Presbyterian college in Ohio, which is known for two people, John Glenn and Agnes Moorehead. And after that, I went to Cornell Law School, and after that, I got my first job. And my first job was a clerk for a judge in the Supreme Court of the state of New York. It was a great job, but you only do that for a year or so. So I did that, and I went off to Chicago as assistant to the president of something at those days called the Chicago Board of Trade, which was the largest commodity exchange in the world. And that year was the year a bunch of federal laws, a bunch of federal pressure was on the exchanges to get rid of something called a fixed commission structure. And the result of that was the Chicago Board Options Exchange was one of the answers to that. And so we set up the Chicago Board Options Exchange, which is still a very robust organization today. And so I did that. I left there and came to IBM. I was on my way to Wall Street to take a job in a Wall Street, what they call white shoe law firm. And I got a call from IBM asking me if I would be willing to interview with them. Kind of an unusual request. So I said, well, why not? Armonk is on the way to New York City. So I stopped and I met this guy by the name of Nick Katzenbach. Nick Katzenbach had been the Undersecretary of State and the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, and he was the guy who stood at the courthouse door in Alabama and desegregated the University of Alabama and confronted George Wallace and all those famous pictures of that. Great human being and a great guy. And so I joined IBM, and I would ultimately spend 28 years at IBM, mostly as an antitrust lawyer, which in those days everybody was an antitrust lawyer at IBM, with a couple of perturbations. And one of them was I was living in San Francisco doing an antitrust trial for IBM. At that era, which was in the late 70s and early 80s, IBM had hundreds of antitrust suits against us, basically following on what the U.S. government had done. Ultimately, the U.S. government case was dismissed, and in the case of the private antitrust suits, had we not won them all, which we did, the federal government would never have been politically able to dismiss it. So they were important. So I was out there and working on the trial of two companies. One was Memorex against IBM, and the other one was Transamerica versus IBM. And they ended. And they ended up with IBM winning. And I found I had worked myself out of a job. So IBM decided I should go to business school. And there was this little business school named Stanford down the road. They said, that's where you're going to go. I said, great. The only problem was that it required at least college-level calculus to get through the GMAT exam. My last math course was ninth grade algebra. I was in deep weeds. So I hired a PhD student at Stanford, a postdoc who was really, really bright. And in 3 weeks, she crammed enough calculus in me that I could take the exam, which is all I could ever do with the calculus, because one day, 1 hour, 1 minute after the exam, I forgot everything I learned, which is just as well. But anyway, I got in there and I did that. And after that, IBM was trying to figure out what to do with me. So they sent me to Asia, to Japan, where we were setting up a new Asian headquarters. And our territory was the 38th parallel in Korea. So we had South Korea all the way to New Zealand and all the way over to India. And I also was the general manager of India at the time, although we were banned from selling there for whatever reason. But I had it's a kind of an interesting story. India banned IBM from marketing there unless we gave up our trademark to them. And same with Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola refused and left the country, and we refused and left the country, but they still needed IBM computers, so that we sold them all offshore to India, and they were basically twice as expensive. But pride is there anyway. So I had that, and we had all of Asia, and my family and I, including my 80-year-old mother-in-law at the time, lived in downtown Tokyo. There were no English signs or anything like that, and my kids obviously had to go to English-speaking school, but it was a fantastic experience. Probably the best thing we ever did in life as a family. My kids loved it. I loved it. I spent too much time on airplanes, but it was a great experience. When I went to Japan, I did something that, in hindsight, was a pretty good idea. I took Japanese lessons every day for 3 years in my office at 7 in the morning. I had a Japanese tutor come in, and we would work on Japanese. Now, by the time I left, I had actually a pretty good working knowledge of what you would call basic Japanese. I couldn't write it. The kanji characters you have to have 5,000 to 10,000 of them before you're even considered literate. And they're pictographic. They're not words as our brains are taught. But what it did was it sort of demonstrated a desire to learn the culture and to be part of it and to understand it more than anything else. And I discovered that the Japanese really appreciated the effort being made to do that. So that was a really good idea, and I was really glad I did it for 3 years. So I could speak it. When we came back, my children could not only speak it, they could write it, because they were young. They were 7 or 8 years old when they went over there. Of course, unless you use it, you lose it, and so they can't do that anymore, but they could at the time. It was also part of the process that made it a great, great experience, that they were taking the buses and the subways, public transportation at age 7 in downtown Tokyo with 26 million people, and nobody worried about it. And they weren't getting lost or anything like that. It's a great experience. My 80-year-old mother-in-law became a rock star in Japan because nobody had seen an 80-year-old Western woman with white hair and all that stuff. They all thought that we put our old people on ice floes, and let them drift away. I'm serious about that. And they used to have these magazines in Japan called Friday, and I don't know what they were. They were just really pictographic picture magazines. And my mother-in-law was in them every week. They'd take pictures of her shopping, pictures of her going to church, all this stuff. She was in them every. So she became famous in Tokyo for 3 years. This is actually, and people used to walk up on the street and feel her hair and just see what that was. And they did with my kids too, because they're little blonde kids. They'd never seen that either in those days. But it was a great experience, and we really got immersed into the culture of the thing. And I think that's anybody who's going to go overseas and do that, I would recommend that you make an effort to be part of the system. You'll find it immensely helpful. I got done with Asia, and I came back and I ran the government relations, or at least a big chunk of it, for IBM for about 3 years in Washington, D.C. ultimately they wanted me to stay there and do that. But, you know, in Washington, if you're not a Republican or a Democrat, they really don't know what to do with you. And I'm a big-time independent. So if you're neither boy nor girl, you have a problem in that model. So I said no to that. And they said, well, what do you want to do? And this was in 1989, 1990. And IBM was in serious trouble in those days. We got down to 100 days of cash before we were going to go bankrupt. And I had learned in Asia the importance of something called intellectual property. Well, how did I learn that? It wasn't something that actually they taught in law school. I learned it because the major Japanese computer manufacturers all copied IBM's mainframe software, and which was worth millions of dollars. And how did we discover that? Well, a programmer up in Poughkeepsie, New York for IBM named what's called a loop in the program after his girlfriend Judy, which is not exactly a common Japanese name. But when you did the analysis of Japanese programs and the millions and millions of lines of code, you'd find Judy. And so all the usual names of you that you'd expect from the Japanese companies, Hitachi, Fujitsu, Sony, 5 or 6 others, they all had Judy in their software. And IBM, and of course that became the main competition for IBM in the mainframe business. So we're sort of in a sense competing against ourselves because we'd been very sloppy about the intellectual property and they all got their hands on it. So I kind of made the point that it was time for IBM to forget the days when it had been arguably a monopoly, or at least the government thought we were, and act like a real company. We had all this intellectual property and we ought to darn well try to optimize it. And then basically the argument came down, well, you've shut up your mouth about this for so long, why don't you figure out what to do with it? So I said, okay, I'll do it. So I took that over. Now, one of the things I discovered in 1991, that here was IBM, in many ways the largest intellectual property holder in the world at the time, was actually paying money out, net out, for licenses from other people. And in return, they got something they would call freedom to operate. They weren't going to get sued by anybody for patent infringement. And that was okay as long as you had most of the money in the industry. It's not okay when you're almost out of money and you're basically giving an R&D gift to other companies. So we had to change that model. And we did change that model. And we were quite successful. We got up to, we were making $2 billion a year after expenses, which were not even $100 million. So it was a really good investment for the company, and a really good return on investment. And of course, that kind of return is what we would call gross equals net. It just fell to the bottom line, and it does marvelous things for your P&L, and your chief financial officer quickly falls in love with you, and all of that kind. So I never, in all those years, 10 years or so, where everybody was having headcount problems and couldn't add resource and all of that, they used to call me up and say, can we give you more people? Will you make that much more money and all that kind of stuff? And the answer was, of course, no, but we're fine, leave us alone. And they left us alone, and we did pretty well with that. And it did another thing for me. I wanted to have a job that took advantage of the fact that I'd been to business school and learned a little bit about business, been to Asia and had 11 corporate functions reporting to me in that job, and I wanted to see if I could stretch myself beyond just the legal confines. And this allowed me to do kind of a job that was in one foot in each camp, one legal foot and one business foot, and that was a great thing to do. So I did that. And on my 55th birthday, I retired from IBM, which is the earliest I could and still get a pension or whatever. And I was a very fortunate receiver of something that IBM called a Career Achievement Award, which was worth a boatload of money to me at the time. And there was one other person who got one, and that was it. And So I left IBM feeling pretty good about IBM. And I left that day, walked out and got on a helicopter from GE that was sitting in the parking lot to take me up to Croton on the Hudson River, where GE had its management group, to talk to Jack Welch's senior management team about intellectual property. And that was a lot of fun. And the guy I worked with, a fellow by the name of Jeff Immelt, and he and I tried to head up a group to help GE do the same thing IBM had done, which proved to be an impossibility because GE is a federation tied together by a income statement. It's not, there are 16 different divisions and they all say their own thing. So the company does not speak with one voice when it comes to intellectual property. They even fight with each other, so it makes it almost impossible to optimize that. So that's what they did. But I got to be a consultant for a lot of big companies as a result of that, Boeing and SAP and what have you. And that was a lot of fun for me. And while I was doing that, I became a venture capitalist for about 3 years. And well, I would say some ups and down successes, because 9 out of 10 venture capital investments fail. So you have to get fairly thin-skinned and expect that you're going to lose a few before you win one, and you hope the one that you win makes up for the ones that you losses on that, or you lose on that 9-to-1 ratio kind of thing, 10-to-1 ratio. So I did that, and I was negotiating a investment in one of the funds we were starting with Bill Gates. And it was a Friday afternoon, and we were sitting in his office in Bellevue, Washington, Redmond, Washington, to be more precise, with our feet up on his desk playing Who Do You Know? Which is fun because we all knew many of the same people in the computer industry at the time. And I was asking him for $300 million, which to me was real money. Not so much to him, but it was real money. And at the end of it, he said, okay, I'm going to give you guys this investment, but I would like you to come to work for Microsoft. So I got on the phone that night and called my wife, and I said, guess what I'm going to be doing? I'm going to be working at Microsoft. She said, you're what? Now, this is 3,000 miles away from Connecticut, where we lived, and caused a few disruptions, as you might expect. But I did the Microsoft thing, the same thing I'd done for IBM, with a difference I'll get to in a second. But we got a little place out on Lake Washington, and I commuted back and forth about every week or so to Connecticut, and it worked out just fine. The difference between Microsoft and IBM is profound. Where IBM used its intellectual property to help it get its legs under it, its financial legs under it, Microsoft didn't need any cash, and it doesn't to this day. It was loaded with cash. In fact, every dollar they would take in like that would be regarded as a tax on the industry and politically destabilizing. And then you have to remember, IBM or Microsoft went through the same antitrust travails that IBM had, only in one sense worse. In IBM's case, they were structural and they could beat the rap, but in Microsoft's case, there were very heavy fines by the U.S. government and by the Europeans. And so I got to Microsoft, and they had a bunch of intellectual property, and they were going to get a lot more. When I got there were fewer than 300, just pick one category, fewer than 300 patents or applications in Microsoft's portfolio. That's nothing for a company with 60-odd thousand employees at that time, the world's largest software company. And so we started a crash program to create more of those. And today Microsoft is right up at the top of the world on that. But the question is, why would Microsoft do that? The answer was to use it to build relationships in the case of Microsoft. Well, how do you do that? Well, Microsoft had a problem. It had basically, because it held a monopoly, and it was a judged one, a monopoly position in Windows software. It could kind of dictate the terms of agreements. And one of the things that dictated on the industry is nobody would ever sue anybody for patent infringement involving Windows. If you used Windows as a customer, you couldn't Fujitsu couldn't sue Hitachi for patent infringement, even if Hitachi used Windows to infringe Fujitsu's patents. Boy, did they hate that. And their governments hate that. And I used to go on trips to Japan, and the government people would just beat the living hell out of me over that clause. Well, the only way around that clause is to figure out some way to reach out to the industry so you're not all going to sue each other. And the answer to that is cross-license each other to their intellectual property and your intellectual property. Much more difficult. It takes about a year and a half to do one of those things, but that was the answer. So we did a whole string of those, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I think we did 680 of them in the time I was there. See, that's 680 peace treaties is what you have to think about what that is. In the software industry, in contrast, IBM had, I think, when I left, about 1900 of those peace treaties around the world. So Microsoft ends up with 700 of them. And those companies don't sue each other anymore. And in an industry that had been terribly litigious, that was a quite a breakthrough. So I did that. The situation at Microsoft when I got there was both an in-your-face, kind of a confrontational situation for reasons I'll go to, and also a realization that something had to change. The realization that something had to change existed with Bill Gates and the general counsel of the company. You got one step below that, and the rest of the organization was fat, dumb, and heavy, thank you very much. Kind of an attitude that said, well, we make more money than anybody else in the world. A fortiori, we are the smartest people in the world. Not unlike IBM back in the heyday in the 60s and 70s and early 80s. What that means is, of course, you could convince Bill Gates all you wanted, but if you couldn't change the culture beneath that with the 60-odd thousand people, you were not going to get anywhere. So what that means is it's kind of a constant sales call, if you will. You're always out there telling people, I know I've told you this before, Joe, but here's why this is important, right? And then you'd have to use a guy like Gates as backup. It was even worse in the case of Bill Gates because that agreement that I was talking about that they inflicted across all the Windows users of the world, he wrote. And so the reaction I always got was, well, you can't change that. Bill wrote it. So finally, I ended up sitting with Bill. Bill, I got to change this thing. You don't understand. Everybody in the planet hates it, and it's just going to get you antitrust suit after antitrust suit if we don't go with a different model. He said, well, what's the different model? I said, well, we have to go out there and make peace in the valley. We've got to start licensing our intellectual property to people and vice versa. And then the question is, could you do it in time? As you're transitioning from one, can you get the other one geared up fast enough so we don't get 700 lawsuits or something like that? And the answer was, yeah, we could. And so that was that. But the cultural shift was even harder. And it goes on. This is not, it slips back. I mean, in my view, IBM has slipped kind of back a little bit from this because they forget it. And so you have to keep reminding them of it. So as I say, it's a constant war organizationally. But Bill did something that I thought was really smart. He said, I said, Bill, I need you to help me do this. I said, we need next year, we probably ought to go pick a number. We ought to get 10,000 patent applications. And here are the 13 areas that are really important. And we would line them up by the business units. And I would draft a letter and he'd send an email to each of the heads of those units. Said, your goal this year is 500 of these in your area. Pick whatever your area it is. Your goal is 1,000 of these in your area, and I'll fund it, but you have to get there. And by the way, it's going to relate to your job performance at the end of the year. And he would do that. Boy, was that helpful. Because if you don't get that, if you don't have the support of the top guy, you're dead trying to do this thing organizationally. He did another thing. We started holding something we called invention sessions, which we had done at IBM. And these were rather unique. We would get the smartest people in the company from different disciplines and sit them in a room for a day or 2 days. And Bill would attend. First one we had was 2 weeks after I got there. So the head of research, the head of engineering, the division heads, who are all techies in Microsoft context. And we, as I say, we had done the same thing at IBM. And Gates sat there, and we brainstormed for 2 days. And just to show you how this works, is the first one we ever did. He walked in the room. He was on a phone call. He was 5 minutes late. And he walked in. And he said, "You know what? I don't know what this is. 2003. I don't know what it means or what it is, but I have a feeling this thing called cloud computing is going to be important." And everybody looked around and said, "What the hell is cloud computing?" We didn't know. So we made it up. And at the end of a day, we had 26 patents that we were going to file in the field of cloud computing, which that morning at 9 a.m. nobody knew what it was. And it's gone on from there. And Microsoft's been very successful in cloud computing, a lot of it because nobody can really stop Microsoft from proceeding because they have much of the intellectual property in the field. And the worst thing that happens to them is they end up trading it with IBM or cross-licensing with IBM or Oracle or Amazon or what have you, or Google, to pick 4 or 5 there that are all in the field. And so they sort of have a risk-free highway to run the thing on. But that's an example of the kind of cultural thing. There are lots of other cultural things at Microsoft that would drive you nuts. I remember my first day, my first staff meeting, I went in there and spoke to everybody who was in the few hundred people who were in the operation. And afterwards I had all the staff heads in, and there were 15 of them. I said, "How the hell can I have 15 direct reports in this job?" If that wasn't bad enough, they were on this big conference table, and they all had their computers open, and they were doing emails constantly. You could have danced on the table naked and no one would have noticed. So I did 2 things. I banned computers in the meetings, which immediately they ran off to Bill and said, "You know what this guy did?" And I banned PowerPoint. Now, why PowerPoint? Well, because everybody was, and that's a Microsoft product, by the way. So talk about double heresy. So I banned that because everybody was becoming a PowerPoint PhD. And they had things flying in from the sides and up and down and all that. And you sort of got rewarded on the beauty of your charts, not on what the charts said or what you said. And I kind of wanted people to listen to each other and see if we could get any mileage out of that. So I got away with both of those things. The third thing I got away with was in the middle of this deal, I think 3 or 4 years into it, we decided to write a book about my experiences at Microsoft. And of course, you can imagine what the reaction was, right? The legal department said, "Absolutely not." The HR department said, "You got to be kidding me." The PR department went absolutely buggy over this thing. So you had all the, the departments of no saying no at the same time, and you had this kind of fierce resistance, especially since you're an employee. So they marched in to see Bill, and they said, "This crazy guy is going to write a book about his Microsoft experiences." And Bill says, "Oh, I think that's a great idea." And they said, "Well, we do too, Bill. We just wanted you to know that this was going on," kind of thing. So I was able to write the book. Most of it, I had to take something out for other reasons, but I was able to do that. But that's kind of what it was like dealing with Microsoft. By the way, any big company would have reacted the same way. You could be at Ford and say, "I'm going to write a tell-all about Ford," if you're still an employee, and you can imagine the usual suspects would go ballistic. I'm picking on Ford. Take any company you want. Be the same kind of thing. So that was really what Microsoft was like at the time. I actually wanted to go to medical school, but it became pretty obvious to me that I wasn't really good with blood. So that was probably a bad choice. I didn't have, as we talked earlier, I didn't have a math and science background really. So that engineering and that kind of stuff was out. I'm running out of options. So finally I figured, well, I'll give law school a try. And it was really a process of elimination. I didn't know what law school was, really. But it was great. I mean, I got a full scholarship to Ohio State, and I got a half scholarship to Cornell, and I got no scholarship at Yale. So those are my three choices. Cornell was very close to my home up in Binghamton, New York. It was in Ithaca, which is an hour away. So that was kind of an easy choice, so I took that one. And I got there and quickly realized how bloody hard it was. College was a roll, just an easy roll compared to law school at that level. But I'm glad I did it. And so that's how I ended up in law school at the time. That's the only way, the only reason. And once you're there, you better make it work, I think. I struggled the first year. Second and third year were fine, but the first, boy, was really tough. I had this course called Contracts, and they went out of their way to make it difficult and obfuscate everything, because everything is Socratic method, and you think you know the answer, and they'll give you another question, and it'll just go on and on and on like that. At the end of the day, you walk out knowing less than you did when you walked in, and I think that was the whole point. So when I finally got to teach law school, I saw great irony in all of that, and tried to get a little bit away from that questioning everything constantly kind of model. But yeah, law school was an interesting experience. But so was business school, not because it was a Socratic method, because it wasn't. It was the exact opposite. Law students and business students, I've taught both, are entirely different. Law students read everything, business students read nothing. And I used to try to get them all in the same combined classes on things like intellectual property, which are both a legal and a business issue. And it was hysterical. The law students knew all about the assignments. They knew every footnote and would miss sometimes the message completely. The business students would get the message completely, but had no reason, no understanding of why. So that's, it was just kind of, they were passing in the dark to a great degree, but it was a lot of fun doing that. And so I was glad I got to do that opportunity. When I was teaching this up at Cornell, the field of intellectual property was changing daily. The Supreme Court was involved in it now, and about every week they were issuing a new decision which changed the groundwork completely. What that meant was every textbook was irrelevant. So I taught it out of the newspapers and business articles. And it was much more difficult because I had to read everything that was available and put together a stack that high given for the week. Well, my last class was 11. I had 11 students, and they were all at least PhDs, and 6 of them were judges in foreign jurisdictions. So I had 2 judges from Thailand, 2 from France, and 2 from I don't know where else. That was really tough because if you take law students and you don't give them a textbook, back to my point about the law students read everything, they don't know what to do. It's like, they're going to have the big one right there. They don't have any certainty, and they can't wing it. So it was a much different experience. But I did find that the business students would get the concepts right, but they weren't sure why. The law students would understand the why, but not what the heck that rolled up to. And so that's kind of what my not so brilliant take on all of that was. And then in the process, I got a couple of nice things happened to me. I got a I was in the first class of something that a European group started called the Intellectual Property Hall of Fame. And the cool part about that was I was one of the few that were still alive, because Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and Victor Hugo, people like that had been long dead, and I'm there. So that was neat. And I was hoping it didn't mean anything, particularly health-wise, but I did that, and and then I retired from Microsoft. I had told Bill I would stay for 3 years, and I ended up staying for 6. And I could have stayed longer, but I decided I wanted to kind of get back to Connecticut and get all that sorted out. And that was a good call. So I went back to Connecticut, and that was about 7 years ago, I think. And since that time, I've been spending a lot of time with the academic world. I became a legal scholar in residence up at Cornell Law School for a year, did that. I became an executive in residence down at Duke in their business school for a year, did that. I've been a consultant to about probably 15 companies in my life at this point in time. I still have all kinds of venture capital kinds of things left over. And I have a real estate business that my partner and I started in 1987 in California. And boy, has that been a good thing to hold on to. And that's still going. In fact, I'm leaving here tomorrow to go out there, and that's one of the things I'm going to do. And I wrote a book in the meantime about my experience at Microsoft, which was a lot of fun. Those of you who think about writing a book, it's a lot more work than you think it is. But it's worthwhile, as everything is. So that's kind of where I am today in that. I would be remiss if I didn't say that I have a terrific home situation. My wife's been very supportive of all of this. She was the assistant to the chairman of IBM when we got married, which caused me no end of aggravation from people kidding me about, feathering my own nest and all of that. I've got 2 kids. My son is an investment banker at Lazard in New York, and he's doing quite well. My daughter is married to a managing director at J.P. Morgan, and they're doing fine. And I've got 7 terrific grandchildren. So that's my current arsenal in that category, and I'm trying to spend a lot more time with that whole bunch than I was able to before, and that's working out fine, and it's a lot of fun. And so that's pretty much where I've been and what I've done at this point in time. If I look back on it, and I gave this commencement speech at a college, and I was trying to think about what it is about life that you can take away from all of that. And it works much better looking backwards than it does working forward. When you're looking forward at things that happen, you don't really see them as an inflection point necessarily. You realize that looking backwards. So I maybe have 5 or 6 of these little inflection points, and I'll just whip through them, and because everybody will have these things, but they won't realize it until we might say until it's too late, right? But I mean, I guess the first one I can think of was I wasn't going to college for reasons that I talked about earlier at all. My high school guidance counselor recommended that I become a garage mechanic at the time, and my parents thought that was probably a good suggestion. But the minister of our church said to me at the end of May in 1962, after high school graduation, he said, "What are you doing next year? Where are you going to college?" I said, "I'm not going." And this was a pretty gruff guy, and he said, "The hell you're not." And he said, "Come into my office." And he picked up the phone, and he was on the board of directors of this school in Ohio. And he called him up, and he said, "I've got a new student for you. 3 weeks later, I'm driving to the middle of East Nowhere, Ohio, to go to college. Who would have thought? And that worked out very, very well for me. And so that was the first one. I think the second inflection point was, I said earlier, I'm getting ready to go to a Wall Street law firm, which was a very traditional approach. And I got this call from IBM out of the blue. And I could have easily said, no, I'm not interested. I've got another job offer and I'm going to take it. But no, for whatever reason, I went and I did that. And that was a start of a 28-year career doing that. The third inflection point was in the middle of that. We won all our antitrust cases and I'm jobless, basically. And I get sent to business school. Who would have thought? Certainly not me. But that made it possible so that every other job I've had since that time has been a business job as opposed to a legal job. And I can jump back and forth between those two disciplines without much trouble. I guess the fourth one, if I had to pick one, was here I am trying to negotiate a deal with Bill Gates to invest money, and I end up working for the guy. Didn't expect that. So those are just examples of what sort of happens to you. I guess if I had to say, what is it that really helps you in life? The first one is to realize that life is really unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen. You don't know about illnesses. You don't know about, you may fall and break your leg. You don't know what may happen to you in life. If that's true, and I think it is, unless you're born really, really wealthy, might be more predictable, or maybe it's less. I don't know. If that's true, one of the keys to success is being really flexible and really open to the possibility that maybe this harebrained idea that somebody called you with is worth looking at. I always think about younger people. They really ought to take a chance, especially when you're young and you can afford to take a chance. You can be goofy when you're in your 20s. And I don't mean just goofy for its own sake, but I mean, you want to go to Africa to study what African horn frogs or something like that? Well, go do it. That's the only time you can afford to do it. You can live like it doesn't matter. And that's really important. And something out of that may happen to you that is entirely unexpected. So so life being unpredictable. The second one is be flexible and adjust to it, because change is a constant. It's not an exception in life, in my opinion. And the third thing I would say to anybody who thinks about success over the long term is perseverance really matters. I can remember being in meetings as a young lawyer and even a young businessman, watching some other people saying, I can't compete with them. They know much more than I do. I'll never be able to do that. But you really ultimately learn, if you persevere, you've got a much better chance of success than some of the people who you look at, and they're really more flash in the pan than they are much else. And that becomes clear, but only over time. I would recommend for anybody, recognize that life is uncertain and it changes all the time. And in spite of your best plans, it's going to change again. And your plans won't work. There was a great philosopher by the name of Mike Tyson who had a philosophy that went, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's exactly the point. So if life's going to change, I would say my second point is you better learn to accept change and be really flexible. Not only accept change, you ought to welcome it. A lot of people fear change. If you can get yourself around to say, things are going to change and I'm going to take advantage of that, you're ahead of the game. And then my third tip is, no matter what happens, ups and downs and things that go sideways, if you keep persevering, you're going to come out ahead. Period. Do I have any regrets? Not really. I think I've been very fortunate on the regret front. were there some business things that I was involved in that in hindsight, I wish I could have grabbed a hold and changed? Sure. Part of that is just being investing in a bunch of little things. And I've learned on the little things that some of these companies that people start, it's really more about them than it is the companies, and they get their egos involved in it. And you really can't do much with that at some point in time. So I wish some of those had worked out better. But, you know, I've worked for two rather magnificent companies and been successful at it. I am the first person who's ever been a corporate officer of IBM and Microsoft in the same lifetime, because those two companies don't necessarily get along real well. So it's hard to have regrets. Everybody in my family is blessed with good health, and that's really the most important thing. And my kids are doing well. I got 7 great grandkids. It's hard to have regrets in that model. And so, no, I don't have any regrets right now.